Okay, so my psychodynamic synergy paradigm here again. You've seen this before, but you're going to see it again and then again and again. Model 1, the interpretive perspective of classical psychoanalysis. Model 2, the deficiency compensation or corrective provision perspective of self-psychology and those object relations theories emphasizing internal absence of good or the errors of omission. Deprivation and neglect. Model 3, the intersubjective perspective of contemporary relational theory and those object relations theories emphasizing internal presence of bad as a result of trauma and abuse. All right, so there are then these 3 modes of therapeutic action that are mutually enhancing, not mutually exclusive. But very importantly here, they are relevant for crisis intervention. I do a lot of 1-shot, 2-shot, 3-shot consultations on patients in crisis. They're patients I had not worked with before and will not continue working with, but I see them for 1 or 2 or 3 sessions, crisis intervention. And there too, I work with these 3 modes of therapeutic action to facilitate their development of greater awareness, greater acceptance, greater accountability. Okay, so relevant for crisis intervention, medication management, short-term intensive treatments, long-term in-depth psychotherapy. This is not just for psychoanalytic work. This is long-term in-depth psychotherapy. It can be short-term intensive treatment, medication management, crisis intervention. Relevant also for whatever the degree of health and or psychopathology, and whether the patient is high functioning or low functioning. Because basically, this psychodynamic synergy paradigm is all about the therapeutic process. It's not even specifically about diagnosis per se. Now, admittedly, Model 1 will tend to focus on neurotic defenses, but then we all have aspects of ourselves that are neurotic. Model 2 will tend to focus on narcissistic vulnerability, narcissistic defenses, but we all have aspects of ourselves that are narcissistic. And finally, Model 3 will tend to focus in on characterological defenses or character disordered defenses, but then we all use those defenses at some point or another. What's relevant here in my synergy paradigm is the therapeutic process and what in the moment is the focus of the patient's attention. And again, I'm going to say a little more about that in the next slides. But indeed, the therapist will be able to optimize her therapeutic effectiveness if, moment by moment, as she sits with the patient, she's able to transition back and forth, back and forth, back and forth from one mode to another, so that over the course of a session, there might have been 70 transitions from Model 1 to 3 to 2 to 3 to 1 to 2 to 3 to 1. It's not about, some people will think, well, Model 2 is you get the person feeling really comfortable and you're empathic and they feel comfortable and they settle in. Then you can do some interpreting, Model 1. And then finally you can negotiate at the intimate edge, Model 3. No, I think that you can actually do any and all of those things back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. It's not a hierarchy. It's not a hierarchy. So the therapist back and forth, based upon, and I love these words, what the therapist senses is most immediate and most emotionally laden for the patient in the moment. Or as Bob Mailman would say, one of my mentors, based on the point of emotional urgency for the patient, the point of emotional urgency, what would seem to be most pressing for the patient, not for the therapist, but for the patient. So based upon what the patient is presenting, the point of emotional urgency, what's most immediate, what's most emotionally laden, that's where the therapist will go. So whether in the moment the therapist senses that the patient is her resistance to gaining insight or awareness, and to taking responsibility for why she is so stuck in her life. Model 1, neurotic, defenses, stuckness, neurotic, conflictedness, jammed up, stuck. Her resistance to gaining insight, her resistance to gaining awareness. Model 2, her refusal to confront, grieve, and accept disappointing realities about the people in her life. Model 2, her refusal to confront, grieve, or mourn, and ultimately accept disillusioning realities about the objects of her desire in her life. Model 2. And Model 3, her reluctance to hold herself accountable for what she enacts in her relationships. Model 1, I did say taking responsibility for, but that's dysfunctional internal dynamics. And Model 3 is holding herself accountable for, taking responsibility for what she plays out on the stage of her life. Now, I hope you will notice, I who love symmetry, I'm talking about in Model 1, resistance. We're going to see that that's the defense, resistance. Model 2, refusal, relentless pursuit because of one's refusal to confront, grieve, and accept. So there are your R words, relentless pursuit because of her refusal to grieve. And Model 3 is reluctance to hold herself accountable and therefore compulsive and unwitting reenactment, there's the R word, repetition, reenactment of unmastered early on relational traumas on the stage of her life. Again, that's the contemporary relational perspective, intersubjective perspective. Okay. All right. In other words, Model 1, if in the moment the spotlight is on the patient's internal conflictedness, the therapist dons her Model 1 hat, and by the way, can then use a conflict statement, which we'll get into in later sections, or it might be the patient's relentless pursuits, her refusal to confront, grieve, and accept the reality of the limitations, separateness, and immutability of the objects in her world. So the patient's relentless pursuits, whether those pursuits are in relation to the infantile objects, the parents or whomever, contemporary objects, or the transference object, the therapist herself. Or finally, in those moments when the spotlight would seem to be on the patient's compulsive and unwitting, meaning unaware of, unwitting repetitions or reenactments in the treatment on the stage of her life, then the therapist will don her Model 3 hat. Back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. In essence, all 3 models are relevant for both momentary trait, like in the moment the patient is being neurotic or narcissistic or character disordered, or a more sustained, more enduring, more characterological state. So again, it's not about diagnosis. So if you're okay, please, with this, let me use those words a little bit, but with it being understood, neurotic, narcissistic, noxious. But those are words that are relevant for all of us. All right, so Model 1 features neurotic conflictedness and is relevant when in the moment the patient is resistant, there's the R word, and or not aware, there's the A word, the adaptation, which will call for a conflict statement. Model 2 features narcissistic vulnerability and is relevant when in the moment the patient is relentless and or not accepting. There's the R word, relentless. There's the A word, the adaptation, not accepting. So the defense, Model 1 is resistance, right? Patients are resistant, we know that. Classical psychoanalytic theory. Or the patient is relentless hope, relentless pursuits of that which can never be. That's the defense because of refusal to confront and grieve the reality of the world as it is. All right, and Model 3 features noxious. And I had to say noxious, 1, it's true. And 2, of course, neurotic starts with an N, narcissistic starts with an N, and noxious starts with an N. Noxious relatedness. And I learned only later on that the difference between relationship and relatedness, relationship tends to, at least in psychodynamic, psychoanalytic writing, relationship tends to mean more the internal representation, whereas relatedness is what's observable, to the I, or the relatedness, noxious relatedness, so what one can observe of the patient's behavior. So Model 3 features noxious relatedness and is relevant when, in the moment, the patient is reenacting or repeating, there's the R word, repetition compulsion, Freud called it, and or not accountable, there's the A word, accountability, which will call for an accountability statement. There you go. So Model 1, I hadn't quite said this before, but let me say it now. Model 1, structural conflict. The neurotic defense of relentless conflictedness. They're jammed up, neurotically stuck, conflicted. It's only they suffer. The world around them doesn't. They suffer terribly. Neurotic suffering, structural conflict, internal, one person. Model 2, structural deficit. And again, we all have all of them. The narcissistic defense of relentless need for validation and external reinforcement because of impaired capacity to be internally self-regulating, internally self-soothing and providing for oneself, and instead then a relentless pursuit of it from the outside, a relentless pursuit for external provisions to fill in for internal deficit. So structural deficit. So Model 1, structural conflict. Model 2, structural deficit. Model 3, relational conflict. So whereas Model 1 is about dysfunctional internal dynamics, Model 3 is about dysfunctional relational dynamics. And now we have the character disordered defense of relentless externalization and denial of responsibility. And you can see the goal here will be accountability. Now, for someone who is equally concerned about symmetry and balance as I am, you will notice that we have structural conflict, we have structural deficit, we have relational conflict. Might we have relational deficit? Actually, we do. That's not what this course is about. You'll have to take another course from me, which is more about Model 4, which is a story about relentless despair, the private self, the shattered heart, a life unlived, and it's an existential humanistic approach to relentless despair, whatever. And so it's about relational deficit. But that's not what this course is about. So that's for another time. So for now, we'll stick with, please, this. All right, so again, Model 1, structural conflict, dysfunctional internal dynamics, neurotic conflictedness. Model 2, structural deficit. I want you to be able to sort of almost say these things with your eyes closed. Relentless pursuit of the unattainable. I knew someone, I don't know if you all know the Krebs cycle, right, in biochemistry, or chemistry, I guess. And I had a colleague, a friend, who could recite the Krebs cycle without even looking at a sheet of paper. He knew it so well. So anyway, I'm hoping that eventually all of us will be able to recite these pages without needing to look at them in writing, so that you really register and get it internally. Model 2, structural deficit, relentless pursuit of the unattainable. What the panel of 10,000 objective judges would have said, forget it, it's not going to happen. And yet the patient refusing to confront and grieve and ultimately accept the reality of the world as it is nonetheless relentless in her pursuit of that which can never be. And the panel of 10,000 judges could have said, forget it, it's not going to happen. So here we have, instead of neurotic conflictedness, we have, as we'd said earlier, narcissistic vulnerability to injury, narcissistic injury. These are people who can become narcissistically enraged when they don't get what they had wanted and felt they had every right to get. Okay, Model 3, relational conflict, dysfunctional relational dynamics, how the internal dynamics get played out on the stage of one's life, and now we have noxious relatedness. Okay, Model 1, cognitive, is more cognitive. It's about interpretation. Remember, I'd said that. And this is a repeat of an earlier slide, but I hope it's now going to make more sense. Enhancement of knowledge within. There are the prepositions. Ultimately, a stronger, wiser, and more empowered ego. And remember, I talked about strengthening the ego is what Model 1 is all about. Classical psychoanalytic theory, a stronger ego. And I know that during my analytic training, we took on patients, I had to do controls, 3 controls, and because I was in training and I was supervised by a supervising analyst, and we would, the thing that was important, because this was a long time ago, the thing that was important was their ego strength. We didn't talk about whether they had a consolidated self or if they had an accountable self in relation. No. It was about whether or not they had ego strength. That's a classical psychoanalytic. Boston psychoanalytic, it was more traditional back then. It has since evolved to being a little more contemporary, a little more relational, and so on. Okay, Model 2, affective, provision of corrective experience. 4, ultimately a more consolidated, accepting, and compassionate self. And Model 3, the relational, more relational, engagement in healthy relatedness with, ultimately a more accountable self in relation. These are the goals, ultimately the goals. Another way to say it, the therapeutic action. Model 1, helping the patient advance from resistance to acknowledging painful truths about oneself to awareness of those painful truths, having insight, awareness. Model 2, from relentless hope and refusal to grieve painful truths about one's objects, to acceptance, sober, mature acceptance of those painful truths. Model 3, from compulsive and unwitting reenactment of unmastered early on relational traumas to accountability for one's dysfunctional actions, reactions, and interactions. And my apologies, I know this is kind of repetitive, but I hope that's okay. Hope it's okay that it be repetitive. All right, now how do we know which model to use? Moment by moment, I said we keep transitioning as seamlessly as possible from one to the next. But how do we know which model to use? Well, so I'd like to suggest that psychodynamic psychotherapy is like ballroom dancing. There is a leader and a follower. The patient leads. Interestingly, I'm not going to suggest that the therapist leads. Rather, the patient leads. Now, this is, not all therapists do it this way. I do. And a lot of people do it this way. Anyway, I do. And I have found, I think I was sort of taught to be the leader and the patient to follow. But over time, as I've matured and evolved, I've come to appreciate that more effective is when I allow the patient to lead. And figure that ultimately all roads lead to Rome. So the patient leads, and for the most part, we follow as best we can. I have complete faith in the therapeutic process, and I have confidence that the patient will lead us to wherever she needs us to go, be it her neurotic conflictedness, Model 1, her narcissistic vulnerability, Model 2, or her noxious relatedness, Model 3. And this point of emotional urgency will be continuously shifting. Now, here's a really important something. Instead of asking questions of the patient, which means that I want her to give me something, I want her to give me answers. No, I want to give the patient something. I give and make statements that either technically end with a period or with an ellipsis. ... I rarely ask questions. If I really don't know the answer and I really feel I need to know something in order to proceed, I might ask a question. But otherwise, patient comes in and she's crying, she's upset, and I might be more likely, rather than saying, "Why are you upset?" or "Can you tell me a little bit more?" Tell me a little bit about why you're so sad or crying. That's fine. That's not a bad thing. But I would tend to say, your heart is hurting so bad right now. Your heart is hurting so bad right now. Now, quite possibly for me to say that, I know the patient a little bit, but maybe I don't even. Maybe it's a consultation, and they come in crying, and I'll say, "You're in so much pain right now," and they feel immediately seen and heard. Of course, maybe they're not in pain, in which case I've blown it. But let's say they are in pain. Usually that kind of thing will work. I make a statement that ends with a period, or when it ends with a ... it's suggesting that if I don't have it quite right, the patient can correct me, and then I will immediately correct myself. Okay. So like one time I'd said to a patient, "It just feels so pointless. It just feels so pointless? And she said, no, it just feels more futile. It feels futile. And I said, more futile, yeah, more futile. So I'm right with the patient there, because I really am more interested in giving to the patient than in asking of her that she give me answers. So moment by moment, as we listen, we are continuously deciding whether to support by being with the patient where she is, or to challenge by directing her attention to elsewhere. I'm going to say a little bit more about this later, but we can choose either to be with the patient where she is, or sometimes to direct her attention to elsewhere. Our goal, ultimately, or just immediately, is an optimal balance between the two, optimal stress. And we'll get it wrong again and again and again. That's okay, that's fine. But we're trying as best we can to provide an optimal balance between challenge and support. So finally, last slide in this part, I'd like to borrow from Stephen Mitchell a wonderful anecdote that captures the essence of the quintessential struggle in which all of us are engaged as we attempt to master our art. Mitchell writes, Stravinsky had written a new piece with a difficult violin passage. After it had been in rehearsal for several weeks, the solo violinist came to Stravinsky and said he was sorry. He had tried his best, but the passage was too difficult. No violinist could play it. Stravinsky said, I understand that, but what I am after is the sound of someone trying to play it. As therapists, our work is exquisitely difficult and finely tuned, and often we will not be able to get it just right. Perhaps, however, we can console ourselves with the knowledge that it is the effort we make to get it just right that will ultimately count.